A third straight loss against the New York Islanders, and the Jets might finally have their answer as to whether or not this week needs to be one where they swing big. If ever there was a doubt, that question is absolutely 100% yes.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. As always, if you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we have a lot to chat about after the Jets have dropped another game. Now, I'll preface this by saying I don't think that losing itself is the problem. And I've talked about it before. If this is when you're going to lose, I think the timing is actually quite good. Doing so like just a couple of days before the trade deadline, especially on a 3-game losing streak, in my mind is actually the best time to do it because it tells the front office and it tells the team that they're still not where they need to be. They're very good and they've fixed a lot of things this year, but there is still work to be done. And I think recently we've started to see more and more of what I've talked about over the last couple of years about what this team's construction occasionally runs into when Winnipeg kind of gets set in its ways and doesn't necessarily address some of the core underlying problems. The biggest thing that I think stood out about this game against the Islanders is that, the Jets at 5v5 were fine, but I think, you saw Winnipeg's power play really have to carry the evening. And that's been a problem that I think generally got masked earlier this year. But now that the 5v5 scoring has completely died out and the Jets are basically just living off of power plays, I think it puts into stark relief some of the bigger problems with this team. The Jets, in a lot of ways, do many things right. Their forecheck is good. The depth lines are defensively pretty sound and create some good chances. But in terms of actually converting on those opportunities, the bottom six isn't really where the Jets are going to be able to get a lot of goals from. They just don't score that much. And I think a trade could help that. But really what we're kind of seeing is that the Jets' top six isn't really arranged the way it should be. And I keep harping on this. I've talked about it for years. The second line, I think, has moments where it's really good and moments where it's kind of like, not very good at all. And I think the same can be said for the top line. And in this game against the Islanders, the top line was basically a non-factor for most of the night. The Isles really held the slot down pretty good, and the top line just struggled to create much of anything. There was no real separation from defenders. I felt like there were only a couple of really big chances where the Jets were able to create some really good looks. Kyle Connor was able to walk in once or twice right down the middle of the slot, and Sorokin was, good enough to make the save. But other than moments like that, you just didn't really see enough. And I've talked about the Jets top line needing to be more than just a 50-50 unit, right? You can't have them playing at like a sort of break-even pace, especially compared to how most other teams that go deep in the playoffs are built, right? Your top line is usually winning battles at least 55% of the time. And with the Jets top line, that's not really happening. Now, I think there are ways around this if you start to treat the top line as more of like a shadow second line. The fact is they will score, and they've got enough talent individually to do that. The problem is that when you start facing the Vegases and these really deep teams up and down the lineup that have generally won those matchups against the top line or maybe even some of the other Jets lines, it puts so much stress on everyone else to try and make up the difference, and the Jets aren't really built to do that. The second line has flashes where it can. Sometimes the Lowry line has played hero, but I think at the end of the day, the Jets just need more. And I don't think it's just from a trade. The Jets internally really need to look at how they're built and really how the lines are arranged. What stuck out from this game with the Islanders is the forwards struggled, and the Jets then decided that the defense, with Sandberg sitting because of family reasons, their solution was to put Logan Stanley with Neil Pionk. Yeah, probably wouldn't be doing that. The top pairing with Morrissey and DeMello was kind of so-so for like half the game, good the other half, or so-so might be a little generous. They were not terribly great for about the first half. Second half, they improved. But, the Stanley Pionk pairing was just awful basically the whole game. And on one of the goals directly, Stanley kind of tried to clear the puck. And one thing I do notice with him is like, I don't feel like he head checks all that often. And even when he does, he still fires the puck into defender skates. And he did this time. It created a turnover basically on the net side. And, Pulock had a screened opportunity to one time it or basically just slap it home, and not really how you want to be doing that on a routine basis. And Stanley played 22 minutes. We're talking about a third pairing guy who's probably more of a number 7 on actual contenders, playing second pairing, almost top pairing minutes for the Jets. I think at some point, the coaching staff might want to kind of look at what the results are. I think it'd be one thing if players like Stanley and Pionk on their own sort of pass the eye test, right? But you watch how they play, and when Pionk is away from Sandberg, it's not even close. He's just not even the same player. Defensively, he's all over the place. He's constantly turning the puck over. He's losing physical battles. He's pivoting at the wrong times. And it's leading to a lot of chaotic moments where the Jets get pinned in. And, I look at Stanley in a very similar light. I think Logan really struggles with zone clearances. There are moments further up the ice when his offensive game takes over and he has some decent, offensive rushes, but they're not enough to cover the rest of the mistakes that he's making. And at this level, the Jets just don't have the luxury of, a big margin for error. They really don't. They don't have, a ton of elite forwards who can score 30 goals a game. They've got a great goalie, the best in the league. They've got a pretty good top pairing guy in Morrissey, an elite defender. You've got another elite guy in Sandberg. And then, your forward core is filled with great to very good to pretty decent players. They don't have those individual skaters at the top that can basically just take over shifts. Against bad teams, sometimes the Jets do. But, in a game like this where the Islanders kind of at times outwork the Jets, it just felt like, some of Winnipeg's bigger vulnerabilities were exposed. And I'm not saying this to like rant or anything. I'm not really worried right now, but I think, it just kind of comes back to things that I've said for a while with this team's 5v5 game and how they think about their lineup. I still think the top line just it's not where it needs to be. And I don't think that telling the line that it's not where it needs to be is going to fix it. I think at some point Arniel is going to have to wake up and make that decision for them. I know that he won't. I think that he kind of worries about upsetting, a good thing. And I understand he's been through a lot as a head coach. And for the most part, things have worked out this year. But the deeper you go and the closer you get to the playoffs, I think the fact that your top 6 and arguably your top 9 is kind of all over the place in creation, it just doesn't really lean itself to what feels like a sustainable way to get through the playoffs. I think the trade deadline is where the Jets really need to figure out what kind of team they want to be. I think, losing now in the way that the Jets have is actually really beneficial. I don't know if Arniel necessarily sees it this way, but Winnipeg kind of needs to reevaluate how this roster is currently constructed and go for it. And I want to talk about the importance of doing so and some stuff that kind of needs to happen around the margins, especially with some rumors that are kind of circulating and, some of what we've seen with the deployments. But before we dive into, the merits of taking this big swing, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in on the action at all times. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, be sure to combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Obviously, for the Jets, they'll be taking on a couple of other teams before the trade deadline. Actually, sorry, just one more this week on Thursday, and then, things are going to get a little bit interesting on the actual trade deadline itself. In the evening, they'll be taking on the Devils on Friday, who are kind of beat up right now and just lost Dougie Hamilton. So, that could be a decent opportunity. But on Thursday, the Jets are taking on the Flyers. And if you think that Winnipeg can come away with at least 1 or 2 points out of this game, this is a great opportunity. I would say, this is a perfect chance to throw out $5, right? Because if you're a new customer, you could get $150 in bonus bets if that first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting a little bit about the importance of this trade deadline and that the Jets get it right. I kind of predicted a win for this game against the Islanders, and I was very wrong. So maybe I should just shut up and never predict wins. I don't know. It seems like every time I do, it tends to backfire on me in pretty catastrophic fashion. So thankfully, this game wasn't like the worst thing we've ever seen. It was just kind of like a little mid, right? And I think the Jets are allowed to be mid at times, but I think the continuing trends that I've talked about with the 5v5 stuff, those are higher level challenges that I think Winnipeg really does need to fix. And if they're not willing to change the top line, then you best be darn sure that your middle six is elite, because right now it's not. The best third line in hockey is very good defensively and creates a fair number of chances. They don't score that often. You've got Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton who own zone time, but do you see them really scoring much? Not particularly. Appleton, I think is a particular area of concern for me, just because I look at this line and we know that Niederreiter can be a fringe top six guy. We know that Lowry is too. Appleton's kind of the odd man out. He's an all right fourth liner, and I think that's about as far as I really trust him. The Jets really rely on him for a lot, and I think that they look at him as a better finisher than he really is. And that's going to hurt you at some point when you start facing up against other teams that are built to have more skill and talent in their top 9 unit. Another thing that I kind of look at with this team is, they don't really like to change things at all. It takes a lot for Winnipeg to go through and actually make lineup adjustments. Arniel is pretty rigid in how he sees this team. And I think that continues to be an overriding problem because other teams out there actually change things up. The Caps even switch lines on a pretty routine basis. Winnipeg has among the most common line combos in the league. Like, they use the top line and the third line more than most other teams run their lines on a consistent basis. So, that inflexibility kind of puts the Jets already in a bit of a pigeonhole. And I just feel like it's self-inflicted. Winnipeg is trying to, at times, fit a bit of a square peg in, like, I don't know, maybe an octagonal hole. I don't want to say it's circular because it's not, right? It sort of fits. It kind of does, but the parts where it doesn't give you some real issues. And so I just don't quite understand why Winnipeg won't even give itself the opportunity to figure out what it can be at times. And that's where I sort of look at, the way that they've treated their rookie defensemen over the years in a sort of similar light. I think the Jets oftentimes have very narrow visions of what they want from this team, and it puts them in a tough spot because when things don't start, or don't work, and you start running into real issues, Winnipeg's ability to improvise has been very mediocre, and I kind of see some of the same things with Arniel. And I get why he's afraid at times to try and rock the boat and shake things up. But, if you're a top-level athlete and you're seeing this team not really be at its best, I would kind of wonder if you really are serious about making the cup and winning if you're not being willing, if you're not willing to be open to other changes. You don't have to, agree with every single thing, but it'd be great if this team was a little more open to flexibility, open to change. They are at least open to trades, and I think the Jets do understand that they need to swing big. I think, the lack of 5v5 scoring really shows the need for a big top 6 player of some sort. I don't know quite who they're going to go for. Nelson scored against the Jets in the Islanders game, so maybe he's piqued their interest again. I bet the Isles are now going to do this thing where they stand pat and don't sell, which would be very funny to me. But I just, I look at McCann and Alexiak, and if that's what the Jets bring in, I feel a lot better about things. But I have these nagging doubts about how deep this team can go because they still exhibit a lot of the same issues that previous teams have. I think the biggest change is that your power play is world class, and finally it's starting to score again. Hellebuck is still, a Vezina favorite. And so a lot of that can go a long way during the regular season. But my focus has always been on the playoffs. I worry less about the regular season than I do the postseason. The postseason is where you start facing really good teams. And when you look at the numbers for the Jets' top lines and stuff, they don't really do that well against big teams in the West. Their general performance against playoff opponents that are not wildcard teams, not great. And I mean, you see how they do against Vegas, against Washington, against Dallas. It's been a little up and down, even in the games where they win, like they've beaten, the Stars. But if you actually saw how they did it, you probably understand that, Winnipeg wasn't nearly as good as I think at times some of the score lines have shown. And so I sort of go back and forth with some of the stuff where I do kind of understand where, a lot of the coaching staff is a little bit nervous about making big changes and stuff, but Winnipeg is going to have to do something with this blue line, right? That's a big problem. The forward core needs a huge upgrade. You've got to get 2 to 3 pieces. And I think the Jets are willing to spend, and I think they're going to have to. This team is just not quite good enough. I would say, and I think I've put this in other episodes, but I think they're like 80-ish% of the way there. There's a lot that I think works, but the couple of key things that don't are enough to be a considerable problem in the playoffs. And again, I'm not ranting. I'm not trying to be like super angry. I just think I've seen this happen to this team time and time again. And, I just worry that we're going to see similar patterns repeat. Now, the good news for the Jets is the rest of the playoff field is kind of mediocre. So, you might get away with some of this stuff a little bit more than usual, but I think at some point you're going to run into a team that's going to know exactly how to rip you apart. And in a 7-game series, that's not going to be fun. And if the Jets have any major injuries, good luck. Yeah, we don't have replacements for anyone on the blue line or up front. So Chevy kind of has to hit this one out of the park. Another thing that I think Chevy really needs to do is he's got to get Logan Stanley off the team. Stanley being trusted with as many minutes as he has is now just detrimental. I don't really mean to pick on Stanley because I don't really blame him for this. Logan is doing his best and working hard. It's really incumbent on the coaching staff to recognize that he's being miscast and he's being overused, but they trust him with second pairing minutes. Second pairing, not third, not rotational second pairing minutes when you are missing Dylan Sandberg. That to me is just beyond all evidence. It defies all logic. And that is such a bad blind spot to where, earlier this year I was thinking Stanley wouldn't really be in during the playoffs, but he seems to be a certainty to be in the postseason picture if he's still on this roster. And that just can't happen. You can kind of get away with it if you're a Colorado and you've maybe got a Jack Johnson or something, but even they seem to recognize that he had to come out at some point. And they have the individual talents in guys like Makar and McKinnon to mask that. The Jets do not. They just don't. I wish they did, but they don't. And because they live in that land where they don't, they're going to have to smarten up and make some really tough choices. And I don't blame Stanley individually. I think that he is trying to do his best. And, I don't ever question the effort, but the output and the outcomes are not working in his favor. And if the coaching staff isn't seeing this, I don't even know what they're watching at this point. It just, to me, it's so plainly obvious. And really, it's obvious to a lot of the fan base that, at some point, what are we doing here, right? And I think Chevy, even alluded to understanding some of this a while back. It was very offhand, but he said something about Stanley showing well in a playoff series from 3 years ago. I think against Edmonton, was it? And I just kind of sat there oh, we're citing 3-year-old, 4-year-old playoff runs. That tells me that I don't think the front office evaluates Stanley the same way, but, the coaching staff seem to really like him, so they've kept him. But, at some point here, I don't know, Chevy's going to have to either make a hard choice or we're going to keep seeing some of the same stuff happen over and over again. And I just, it's such a frustration because I feel like this team really has the ability to be a lot better than it is. And some of it is actually just making some internal decisions that are more favorable. But until Winnipeg recognizes that and is willing to make those adjustments, I can't say that I think Winnipeg is going super deep right now. I think that they could get through the first round or two, but beyond that, I have serious questions. And I'm more optimistic than I was last year, but I think it really comes down to whether this home run swing that the Jets hopefully take on Friday moves the needle. If it doesn't, then, I'm not feeling super great about the post-April stuff. But it is what it is. We can only, express so much frustration over it. The Jets are going to do what the Jets are going to do, and they've kind of been consistent in that vision for a while now. So it all you have to hope for is that it at some point pans out. But all of this kind of comes down to a bigger concern that I have, and is Arniel the guy to lead this team going forward? And I sort of wonder about that. Let's chat about, kind of the body of work and how all of this has played out so far in just a brief little bit. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about some interesting higher-level questions about this Jets team heading into the postseason. And one that I've kind of struggled with a little bit is how I feel about Arniel. I think Scott, at a very high level, gets many things right. There's a couple of key things that I think he has really keyed in on, like, Cole Perfetti being relied upon consistently, great. Josh Morrissey continuing to be one of your top defenders, great. The depth lines generally playing a really up-tempo, physical, forechecking game, great. He got Kyle Connor to backcheck, awesome. He also helped, Kupari and some of the fourth liners improve their game a bit, fantastic. It's where you start looking at some of the bigger questions around your top line and your in-game adjustments that I'm like, not really there yet. I think that there's, again, a lot of things that he has done well this year. But, in these details and these sort of blind spots or these worries that he has about maybe rocking the boat and shaking things up too much, I think he's starting to miss the forest for the trees. At some point, Arniel has to be the one to sit there and tell the guys that, if we continue down this road, this is where it ends. I do think to some degree that he sees, at least in a larger way, that this team's direction is maybe not as good as it could be. I mean, he's done some switches before at the start of the season, and maybe he'd be willing to do it again if things got really bad. But, I think even back to Ehlers and Lowry playing together just a brief stretch, him saying he liked the results, Lowry gets hurt, Lowry comes back, he immediately goes back to Niederreiter, Lowry, and Appleton. We talked about, he talked about loving Ville Heinola's game, and Heinola basically played once in the last 2.5 months. So I struggle with what he says and what he's actually done. And I see the Logan Stanley blind spot. I see the top line lack of adjustments. I see the second line continuing to be used the way it is. I just haven't really been sold on him. I think that his hires have generally been really good. Davis Payne, one of the best hires in Jets history. Dean Chenoweth seems to have had a decent impact on the PK. It's at least kind of middle of the packish, which is better than it was before. Still not good, mind you, but better. But beyond that, I have so many questions about this team, and maybe the sample size is just too small to really give a firm verdict. But, the more I've seen from Arniel this year, I think, those lingering questions about what this team does in the postseason haven't really gone away. And I think sometimes, if what Scott's being informed by is part of his experience in Columbus, I get why he's just so nervous about messing with the room. It got to the point in Columbus where he got locked out of the room. And so I totally understand why he is sitting there kind of thinking to himself, if I piss everyone off, I'm going to lose all my credibility. No one's going to want me to manage and coach them, and they're not going to listen to me. So I get it. And I think that that's actually an extremely valid concern. But at some point, if you're the head coach, you kind of have to exercise your authority. And if he's happy with the way that the team is playing, like he said he was in the scrums following the Islanders game, I don't know how I feel about that, other than I think we may have been watching two different efforts. I know that the fancy stats and underlyings for this game may look decent on the surface. If you saw how the Jets played and what they struggled with, you probably know that there's some bigger issues at hand. One only need look at the underlying numbers for the Stanley Pionk pairing and how much they played to understand that perhaps their impact on the game was not particularly great. So, I'm in a tough spot here. I'm hopeful that Arniel can address some of the challenges that have come to this team before. I'm hopeful that maybe he will adjust heading into the postseason. Maybe if things get really bad, he shakes things up significantly and sticks with it. We all know that Maurice kind of had a similar streak, right? It took really big injuries for the team to actually make adjustments. So, Arniel's not really alone in this. This is actually a pretty common problem. I just think Winnipeg is maybe even more diamond handsy with some of their line combinations and their sacred cows than other teams would be. And, is that going to be the thing that sinks the Jets in the playoffs? I really hope not. This team has worked really hard this year. They have come so far. The vibes are super high, but sometimes I just feel like it's a little bit like Sisyphus, rolling up the hill. And at times, Winnipeg's loyalty and their fear of change can put them in a really bad spot. Apparently, Neil Pionk's contract might be announced sometime this week. That's what the rumors from Nick Lynham have been. I don't know what he's heard other than, the contract is really just coming down to term. But if it is what I think it's going to be, which is probably in the $6 to $6.5 million range, 5 to 6, maybe even 7 years on the very high end. Yeah. Well, that's going to be a fun episode, let me tell you. The push apparently to re-sign Mason Appleton, I often wonder what lessons the Jets take when they win games. I think winning the right way is often one of the most informative things, and I feel like the Jets often take the wrong lessons from when they win games. I think we've seen that in the way that their line combinations have been and how unwilling and resistant to change they've been in the past and in the present. So, do I worry that this is going to totally ruin their playoff run? Sometimes. I don't know how much I'm worried about it yet. I think the trade deadline will do a lot to change my perception of things. But right now, I still think that in some ways, Winnipeg continues to be a little bit trapped in the past. But maybe post-Friday, we are singing a different tune. Let me know how you're feeling about all of this. Do you share a lot of my concerns, or are you not so worried? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll have coverage ahead of Winnipeg versus Philadelphia tomorrow, and, of course, a recap on Friday and a preview of Winnipeg versus New Jersey, or if we even have time for that, might be, one of those end of weeks where it's just absolute madness and all we talk about is the trade deadline. So stay tuned. We'll have plenty of Jets coverage then, though. We will see you back here tomorrow evening. So for tonight, have a great one. Thanks for listening. And as always, go Jets go.